Roadway Express didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared while it was winning, profitable, growing, taking market share. The name is gone now, swallowed by what became Yellow Corporation. That's not a story about a company that lost. It's a story about a company that got bought by the wrong people at the worst possible time. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what Roadway actually was, because a lot of people who weren't in the freight industry during Roadway's peak years have no real sense of what the company represented. Roadway Express was founded in 1930 in Akron, Ohio, by Galen Roush and his brother Carol. The timing was not ideal. The Depression was just getting started, and starting any business in 1930 required either a very specific opportunity or a certain kind of stubbornness, and the Roush brothers seemed to have had both. They started with a handful of trucks doing regional freight in the Ohio market, built relationships carefully, and survived the 1930s by being operationally disciplined in an environment where a lot of their competitors weren't. By the time World War II ended and the American economy started its post-war expansion, Roadway was well-positioned to grow into the freight demand that came with it. The growth through the 1950s and 1960s followed a pattern you see with a lot of successful regional carriers from that era. Expand the terminal network steadily, add lanes where the freight volumes justify them, keep the cost structure lean, and build a service reputation that makes customers want to use you again. Roadway did all of that consistently. They weren't flashy about it. There weren't a lot of bold strategic swings or dramatic reinventions. The company just kept executing, kept expanding, kept earning the trust of the shippers who used them. By the 1970s, Roadway had grown into one of the major less-than-truckload carriers in the country, competing directly with Yellow Freight, which was based out of Overland Park, Kansas, and was really the other dominant name in national LTL at the time, and a handful of other large regional carriers. The competition between Roadway and Yellow during that era was genuinely intense. Both companies were building out national networks. Both were investing heavily in terminals and equipment, and both were fighting for the same customer relationships with major shippers who were deciding which carrier or carriers they were going to use for their LTL freight needs. What Roadway had that separated it in the eyes of a lot of shippers was a combination of service consistency and operational efficiency. Their on-time delivery numbers were strong. Their freight damage rates were low. Their billing accuracy was good, which sounds like a small thing, but in the freight industry, a billing error is a customer service problem that eats up time and creates friction, and shippers who were moving a lot of freight noticed when a carrier's billing was consistently clean. These weren't glamorous competitive advantages, but they were real ones, and they were the kind of thing that kept customers coming back. Deregulation in 1980 scrambled the whole industry, same as it did for every major carrier. The old regulated rate system that had provided a certain amount of pricing stability disappeared, and suddenly Roadway was competing on price in ways it never had before, against not just the established national carriers, but a flood of new and smaller carriers who could now enter the market without the licensing barriers that had previously kept them out. A lot of LTL carriers didn't survive that transition. Roadway did, partly because their cost structure was efficient enough to compete at lower rates, and partly because the service quality they'd built gave shippers a reason to pay a modest premium rather than just going with whoever was cheapest. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Roadway kept developing. They started Roadway Package System in 1985, which was their attempt to compete in the small package delivery space that UPS dominated. And while that eventually became a separate company that went through its own series of transformations, it showed that Roadway's leadership was thinking about where freight was going and trying to position accordingly. They also continued building out their LTL network and remained one of the 2 or 3 most important carriers in that space throughout the decade. The thing I find interesting about Roadway from this distance is that the company that Yellow eventually acquired in 2003 was genuinely healthy. At one point, going through some of the financial reporting from that period, Roadway's operating ratios, which is the measure the industry uses to track how much of every dollar of revenue goes to operating costs, where lower is better, were among the best in the LTL sector. They were running efficiently. They were generating real cash flow. The management team that was in place had been around long enough to understand the business deeply and was making reasonably sound decisions about where to invest and where to hold back. And then Yellow came calling. The acquisition in 2003 was valued at around $1.05 billion, And from Yellow's perspective, the strategic logic made a certain kind of sense, at least on the surface. Yellow was the other dominant national LTL carrier. Roadway was the other dominant national LTL carrier. And combining them theoretically created a company with network scale and cost advantages that neither could achieve independently. The combined terminal footprint would be enormous. The combined freight volume would give them purchasing power with vendors and equipment suppliers. The combined brand recognition in the shipper community would be significant. What the deal actually created was something much messier than that. I remember reading an account from someone who had been a Roadway terminal manager in the Southeast and was still with the combined company a couple of years after the acquisition, and his description of the integration process was something along the lines of, "We kept waiting for someone to tell us how this was all going to work, and the answer never really came." The two companies kept running mostly as separate operations for years after the deal closed, which meant the cost savings and efficiency gains that were supposed to justify the acquisition price weren't materializing. And at the same time, the combined entity was carrying the debt load that Yellow had taken on to fund the purchase. This is the part that people who follow the industry found genuinely puzzling at the time and still talk about now. The whole premise of buying Roadway was to create a unified, more efficient operation. But actually doing that meant making difficult decisions. Which terminals to consolidate, which routes to rationalize, which management roles to eliminate when you no longer needed two people doing the same job across two companies. Those decisions are politically painful inside a large organization, especially when the company you acquired has a strong culture and longtime employees who identify strongly with the brand they've worked for. And Yellow, for whatever reason, kept deferring those decisions. The Roadway name itself stayed in use for years after the acquisition, which was actually a reasonable call from a customer retention standpoint. Shippers who had long-standing relationships with Roadway Express weren't necessarily excited about switching to Yellow overnight. But it also meant that the operational integration that needed to happen wasn't happening, because as long as Roadway was a separate brand, it was also, in many ways, a separate operation. The technology systems weren't unified. The customer-facing processes weren't unified. The terminal networks, which overlapped significantly in certain markets, weren't rationalized. At one point, someone who handled freight procurement for a national retailer told me they were receiving sales calls from both Yellow representatives and Roadway representatives, competing against each other, trying to win business from the same shipper, not seeming to understand or care that they were technically the same company. That kind of thing doesn't just waste sales resources. It tells you something about how deep the actual integration had gone, which was not very deep at all. Meanwhile, the debt that came with the acquisition was sitting there generating interest expense every month, and the freight market in the mid-2000s, while generally decent, wasn't generating the kind of margins that made it easy to service that debt while also investing in the operational improvements the combined company needed to make. Something was always getting deferred. Technology upgrades, terminal improvements, equipment refresh cycles, because the cash was going toward debt service instead. When 2008 arrived and the freight market fell apart along with the rest of the economy, the combined YRC Worldwide, which is what Yellow had renamed itself to reflect its expanded portfolio of brands, was in a genuinely precarious position. The debt was still substantial. The operations were still not fully integrated. The revenue that had been covering the gap between what the business actually generated and what it needed to cover its obligations dropped significantly as freight volumes fell. And the Teamsters ended up agreeing to wage concessions to help keep the whole thing alive. Real cuts and real paychecks for the people who actually moved the freight. The Roadway brand survived that crisis in name, but the thing that had made Roadway Roadway, the operational culture, the management continuity, the specific expertise that had made the company good at what it did, was already mostly gone by that point. The people who had built their careers at Roadway and understood the business deeply had either moved on or were operating within a corporate structure so different from what they'd known that the institutional knowledge wasn't really being applied the way it once was. This is a pattern that shows up in a lot of these acquisition stories, and it's worth pausing on because it's not the obvious financial stuff that gets most of the attention. When a company with a strong operational culture gets absorbed into a larger organization that's trying to integrate multiple acquisitions simultaneously while managing a heavy debt load, the cultural continuity just doesn't survive the process. The people who knew how to run terminals efficiently, who knew the customers personally, who understood which service attributes mattered to which shippers. Those people leave, or they get shuffled around in reorganizations, or they end up reporting to managers who don't actually understand the freight business because the combined company has so many layers of corporate structure between the operation and the executive suite that expertise stops flowing in useful directions. Roadway's specific contribution to the combined company got harder and harder to identify as the years went on. By the time YRC eventually consolidated its brands under the Yellow name around 2019, Roadway had been so thoroughly absorbed that the consolidation was mostly administrative. The physical terminals were already in the combined network. The drivers and dock workers had already been integrated into combined contracts. The Roadway brand in the market had faded to the point where it wasn't really drawing on any of the accumulated goodwill from its independent era. Customers who remembered the original Roadway had either found other carriers or were dealing with whatever version of the combined operation they'd ended up with. What's worth thinking about, and I find myself coming back to this, is what Roadway might have looked like today if the acquisition had never happened, or if it had been acquired by someone who approached the integration differently. Because the underlying business was good, the terminal network had value. The workforce had experience and skill. The service reputation was real. A company with those assets, managed through the 2000s and 2010s with the kind of operational discipline that Roadway itself had historically applied, would have had real options. Either to continue as an independent carrier, to invest in technology and service improvements to compete with the newer players coming into LTL, or to be acquired on terms that actually worked for everyone involved rather than terms that worked primarily for the investment bankers who structured the deal. The freight industry that existed in 2023, when Yellow finally filed for bankruptcy and the terminal network got auctioned off to competitors, would have been navigable for a healthy, well-managed Roadway Express. The LTL market had actually grown significantly over those years, and the carriers that invested in their networks and their technology and their service quality during the 2010s, companies like Saia, Old Dominion, Estes, had done very well. Old Dominion in particular became something of an industry benchmark for how to run an LTL operation profitably and efficiently. And a lot of what made Old Dominion successful were the same basic things that had made Roadway successful in its own time. Tight operational discipline, consistent service, efficient terminals, a workforce that knew what it was doing. The difference is that Old Dominion wasn't burdened with the debt and complexity that came from trying to absorb multiple acquired companies simultaneously. They grew organically, built their network deliberately, and maintained enough financial flexibility to invest in improvements rather than directing cash toward debt service. Watching what Old Dominion became during the period when Yellow and its collection of absorbed brands were struggling to stay solvent is a fairly pointed illustration of what a different path for Roadway might have looked like. At one point, going through some forums where former Roadway employees had gathered to talk about the company and what happened to it, the consistent theme in those conversations wasn't anger exactly. It was more like a specific kind of disappointment that comes from watching something good get handled badly. People who had worked at Roadway terminals for 15 or 20 years, who took real pride in the service quality the company delivered, who had real friendships and real professional identities tied up in that brand. They weren't mourning a company that failed on its own terms. They were mourning a company that got taken apart by a process it had no control over and couldn't really survive. The drivers who spent careers at Roadway knew what the company was capable of. The dock workers who ran the terminals knew how efficient the operation could be when it was properly managed. The dispatchers who coordinated the loads knew how much institutional knowledge went into moving freight through the network cleanly. None of that knowledge or capability disappeared because of a corporate acquisition. It dispersed. Some of it went with the people who left. Some of it got preserved in the habits and practices of workers who stayed through the combined operation. But the organizational structure that had channeled all of that capability into a coherent, competitive freight carrier stopped existing, and there was no path to reassembling it once the integration had run its course. The terminals that Roadway operated, many of which were sold in the Yellow bankruptcy auction to Saia, Estes, and others, are in some cases still moving freight today, just under different names and different management. The physical infrastructure persists. The specific knowledge and culture that made those facilities effective under Roadway doesn't, at least not in any organized form. So when people ask what happened to Roadway Express, The accurate answer is that it got bought by a company that didn't know what to do with it, at a price that created financial obligations the combined entity couldn't sustainably carry, and managed through a decade and a half of slow deterioration that ended with the whole thing collapsing in a bankruptcy that had almost nothing to do with Roadway's original strengths or weaknesses. The Roadway that the Roush brothers built in Akron in 1930 and that grew into one of the best freight carriers in the country by the 1990s did not fail. It got absorbed and then dissolved as a side effect of someone else's failure. That distinction matters if you're trying to learn anything from the story, because the lesson is not about what Roadway did wrong. It's about what happens when a genuinely good operating company ends up inside a corporate structure that's too focused on financial engineering to actually run the business. The freight still has to move. The terminals still have to operate. The drivers still have to show up and do the work. And when the people making the big decisions are too consumed with managing debt and negotiating labor contracts and trying to figure out which brand to keep and which to retire, the actual freight operation starts to suffer in ways that are slow and hard to see until they're not. That's the real story of Roadway Express. Not a failure, but a disappearance. And the difference between those two things is bigger than it might seem.